Maya Brooks walked through the burning colony with her rifle held tight against her chest and her eyes, scanning every shadow for movement, but there was nothing left to fight anymore. The enemy had already won and left them to die in the ruins of what used to be humanity's first home beyond Earth, the sky above Kepler 442b, burned with colors that shouldn't exist, and the air tasted like metal and ash and something else that Maya couldn't name but made her stomach turn with each breath she took through the damaged filters of her helmet because the atmosphere processors were gone, along with everything else that made this place livable. 12,000 people had lived here just 2 days ago, and now Maya was one of only 17 survivors who crawled from the wreckage when the attack finally ended, and the beautiful, terrible ships of the enemy rose back into orbit and vanished into the black between stars, without a word or warning or reason that any human mind could understand. The enemy called themselves something that human throats couldn't pronounce, so the survivors just called them the Aethery, which was close enough to the sound their translators made before those translators melted along with most of the technology that humanity had brought to this world with such hope and pride just 3 years earlier. Had been a lieutenant in the Terran Defense Corps, which sounded impressive until you realized that the Defense Corps had never actually defended anything because humanity had never met another intelligent species before, and all their weapons and training had been designed to fight other humans in theoretical conflicts that seemed stupid and petty now that real aliens had shown up and killed everyone. She stepped over a pile of rubble that used to be the school where children learned and played and dreamed about growing up on this new world under these strange stars, and now those children were gone and their dreams were. Ash and Maya felt something cold and hard settle into her chest where fear and grief should have been, but she couldn't afford those emotions anymore because she had to survive. The Aethery had come without warning in ships that looked like they were made of light and crystal and mathematics that bent space around them in ways that made human eyes hurt to look at directly. And when they opened fire, the colony's defenses had lasted exactly 47 seconds before the shields collapsed, and the weapons melted, and the people started dying. Maya had survived because she'd been in the underground maintenance tunnels, checking water recyclers when the attack began, and by the time she climbed back to the surface, it was already over, except for the fires and the screaming, and the terrible silence that came after the screaming stopped. Now, she was searching for supplies and other survivors and any reason to keep breathing when everything she'd known was gone, but what she found instead was something impossible lying in the crater where the research facility used to stand. The Aethery soldier was dying, and that should have made Maya happy, or at least satisfied, because these things had killed everyone she knew. But instead, she felt something else stir in her chest as she looked down at the broken crystalline body that leaked light like blood from a dozen cracks in its translucent skin. It wasn't a soldier, actually, because when Maya got closer, she could see that it wore different markings than the warriors who had destroyed the colony, and its ship was smaller and more delicate and had crashed hard, enough to tear a hole in the ground 50 meters wide. The Aethery looked up at her with eyes that were like stars trapped in ice, and Maya raised her rifle because this was the enemy, and the enemy deserved to die. But something made her hesitate, and in that moment of hesitation, the Aethery spoke. The words came not from a mouth, because the Aethery didn't have mouths in any way that humans would recognize, but from a device on its chest that translated thoughts into sound waves that approximated human speech. And what it said was, "Please, Maya had killed people before in training simulations, and once in a real combat situation when pirates attacked a transport convoy, but she'd never killed anyone who said please, and she'd never killed anyone who was already dying, and she definitely never killed anyone who looked at her with eyes that held something that might have been regrets." So instead of pulling the trigger, Maya knelt down beside the dying alien and pulled out her medical kit, even though she had no idea if human medicine would work on a crystalline being that seemed to be made more of light than matter. But she had to try, because if she didn't try, then she was no better than the monsters who had destroyed her home. The Aethery's name was Velthora, and she was a scientist, not a soldier, and she'd been studying human expansion patterns when the military decided that humanity was a threat that needed to be eliminated before it spread too far into Aethery. Space Valdera had tried to argue against the attack, but the High Council had made their decision, and when the fleet moved to Kepler 44 to be, she'd followed in her research vessel because she wanted to document first contact properly and maybe find a way to communicate with these strange mammals who built cities on worlds that should have been uninhabitable. The fleet had attacked without bothering to communicate, and Velthora had watched in horror as the colony burned, and when she tried to transmit a protest, her ship's systems were disabled by the fleet commander, and she'd crashed during the chaos of the orbital bombardment. Now she was dying on a human world surrounded by the ashes of human dreams, and the only human she could see was pointing a weapon at her face, and Velthara thought that maybe this was justice after Omaya worked on the aliens' wounds with supplies meant for human bodies and prayers to gods she didn't believe in anymore, because gods that allowed this kind of slaughter weren't worth worshipping. But the supplies worked better than she'd hoped because ethery bodies responded to the same basic principles as human bodies, and broken things could be sealed, and bleeding things could be stopped. Velthora lived through the night, and then through the next day, and Maya brought her food and water, even though the alien couldn't eat human food and had to absorb nutrients through her crystalline skin like some kind of photosynthetic plant. They couldn't really talk at first because Velthara's translator was damaged and Maya's knowledge of alien biology was limited to what she'd seen in entertainment vids, but slowly over days and then weeks, they found ways to communicate through gestures and drawings, and the universal language of two beings who were alone in the ruins of a dead world. Velthara told Maya about the E3 Empire, which had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years and had crushed every species that ever tried to resist their expansion, and she told Maya that the attack on Kepler 44 to be E was just a test to see how humanity would respond. Too overwhelming force, humanity stayed quiet and accepted the destruction of their colony. Then the E3 would leave them alone in their little solar system, like a pet species that knew its place. But if humanity tried to fight back, then the Empire would return with its full military might and erase every trace of human existence from the universe. Maya listened to all of this and felt the cold, hard thing in her chest grow larger and colder and harder because she knew exactly how humanity would respond, and she knew that the Ethery had made a terrible mistake when they attacked.
Act Kepler 44.
To be, humanity wouldn't stay quiet. They wouldn't accept their place, and they definitely wouldn't go gentle into extinction, because humans were stubborn and angry and very, very good at holding grudges, but Maya didn't tell Velthara any of that because the alien was still recovering and still guilty about what her people had done, and still trying to figure out why this human had saved her life. Instead of taking revenge instead, Maya told Velthara about the colony before the attack, about the families who'd traveled light years to build a new home, and the children who'd been born under alien stars, and the dreams that everyone had shared about humanity's future among the cosmos. Velthara listened, and something in her crystalline eyes changed, and Maya realized that maybe the Ethery weren't so different from humans after all, because regret looked the same in any species deep. In the ruins of the research facility, something ancient was waking up, and it had been sleeping for so long that it had almost forgotten what it was like to be awake, but the violence of the attack had stirred it from dreams that spanned millennia. It reached out with senses that humans didn't have words for, and tasted the emotions of the survivors and found them interesting. Because these mammals were angry and grieving and determined all at once, the ancient thing had seen species rise and fall across billions of years, and it had learned that most species either surrendered or died when faced with superior force, but these humans seemed determined to do neither. That was new, and the ancient thing liked new things because new things were rare when you'd lived as long as it had, so it watched and waited and began to remember what it had been before the long sleep, when its kind had soared through skies that no longer existed and shaped reality with thoughts that bent physics. Like Clatha, ancient thing remembered being called dragon, and it remembered choosing to sleep rather than watch humanity destroy itself in atomic fire. But now humanity was being destroyed by someone else, and that changed everything because the ancient thing had slept to give humanity a chance to grow up. Now it seemed they'd grown up stubborn and angry and very, very dangerous. The dragon smiled in its sleep and began the long process of waking. 6 months had passed since the massacre, and Maya Brooks stood in the cargo bay of the Defiant watching Velthora work on something that shouldn't exist while the rest of humanity prepared for a war they couldn't. When the Defiant was a stealth carrier, built in the asteroid belt after the attack on Kepler 44b, and it was one of 50 ships that humanity had managed to construct using every resource it could scrape together from mining colonies and orbital stations and the desperate sacrifices of people who sold everything they owned to fund the war effort. Captain Lisa Morgan commanded the Defiant, and she'd taken a huge risk by allowing Velthora aboard, because half the crew wanted to throw the alien out an airlock and the other half just wanted to study her like a specimen in a lab. But Lisa had listened to Maya's report and decided that an ethery scientist who felt guilty might be more valuable than another weapons. System Velthera had brought intelligence with her when she defected, and that intelligence painted a picture of the Etheri Empire that made even the most optimistic human strategist want to curl up and cry, because the Empire had weapons that could crack planets and ships that moved faster than light, and technology that had been perfected over thousands of years. But Velthora had also brought something else, and that something was currently growing in a sealed lab deep in the Defiant's most secure section, where only Maya and Lisa and a handful of scientists were allowed to enter. The lab contained a vault that Velthera had found in the ruins of the research facility on Kepler 442b, and that vault had been sealed with technology that predated human civilization by thousands of years. And inside the vault was genetic material from creatures that humans thought were myths. Dragons had been real once, and they'd lived on Earth alongside early humans before something drove them to abandon the world or die, or simply vanish from history. And Legin Velthora had used Etheri biotechnology to decode the genetic material, and she'd used her own desperate need for redemption to do something that every ethical scientist would condemn, and she'd brought one of the dragons back to life. Dragon's name was Caruth, and he remembered everything. He remembered flying over oceans that no longer existed and hunting prey that had gone extinct millions of years ago, and watching the first humans discover fire and thinking that maybe these clever apes might be worth saving. He remembered the wars between dragon clans and the slow realization that his kind was dying not from violence, but from apathy, because when you could shape reality with a thought, what was left to strive for? He remembered the decision to sleep in stasis rather than watch humanity destroy itself with nuclear weapons, because dragons had seen enough species commit suicide, and they didn't want to watch another one. Now Caruth was awake and angry because humanity hadn't destroyed itself, but someone else was trying to do it for them, and that wasn't how this was supposed to work. Maya had been the first human to meet Caruth after his resurrection, and she'd expected a mindless beast, or maybe a confused animal, but what she'd found instead was an intelligence that made her feel like a child trying to explain mathematics to a professor. Caruth had looked at her with eyes that held 10,000 years of memory, and he'd spoken in a voice that resonated in her bones, and he'd asked her a single question. "Should I help you, Maya?" Had thought about that question for a long time before answering, because she knew that the wrong answer would mean the dragon would simply go back to sleep and leave humanity to its fate. So she'd told him the truth. She'd told him that humanity didn't deserve his help, and that they were violent and short-sighted and stupid in all the ways that young species were stupid. But she'd also told him that humanity refused to quit, even when quitting was the smart choice, and they refused to surrender, even when surrender would save lives, and they refused to accept that they were weak even when the universe kept proving it to them. Caruth had listened, and then he'd done something that surprised everyone. Had laughed. It was a sound like thunder rolling through mountains, and it shook the walls of the lab and made the scientists scramble for cover. But Maya had stood her ground, because she'd survived the massacre at Kepler 442b, and a laughing dragon wasn't going to make her fling. Caruth had told her that he'd spent 10,000 years waiting for humanity to grow up and become wise. But maybe wisdom was overrated when you had stubbornness instead, so he'd agreed to help. Not because humanity deserved it, but because he was curious to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object in humanity. It was definitely immovable in all the worst ways. Velthera had bonded with Caruth in ways that confused everyone, including Velthera herself. because E3 weren't supposed to feel strong emotions, and they definitely weren't supposed to. Warm attachments to creatures from primitive worlds, but something about Caruth's ancient consciousness resonated. With Velthera's crystalline biology, and they could communicate without words in a way that felt natural to both of them. Military reports called Caruth Velthera's pet because calling him anything else would have caused panic among the crew. But everyone who'd met the dragon knew that he was nobody's pet. Chosen to help Velthora because he saw in her the same thing he'd seen in early humans thousands of years ago, which was the capacity for change and growth and maybe redemption. Elisa. Morgan had been skeptical when Maya first reported what Velthora had done because resurrecting ancient genetic material sounded like something from a horror vid, but when she'd met Caruth herself, she'd understood why Maya had been so insistent. Dragon wasn't just a weapon or a tool or even an Alahi, was a reminder that humanity wasn't alone in the universe, and that other species had faced extinction and survived. And that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't end in Ash's butt. Lisa also understood that hope was dangerous when you were fighting a war you couldn't win, so she'd made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She'd asked Velthera to share everything she knew about Etheri technology and weapons. And tactics, not just the intelligence. About military deployments and fleet movements, but the forbidden knowledge that the Etheri kept locked away because it was too dangerous, or too destructive, or too likely to destroy the user along with the target. Velthera it hesitated because sharing that knowledge meant betraying her people completely, and there would be no going back and no forgiveness if she survived the war. But then she'd looked at Caruth and thought about the 12,000 humans who died on Kepler 4 for 2B, and she'd made her own choice about redemption. So she'd opened her database and shown the humans things that made their scientists pale and their military commanders grin, like Wolf's the Etheri had weapons that could manipulate space and time and reality itself, but they'd banned most of them thousands of years ago, because using them required a level of desperation that civilized species weren't supposed to feel. Humanity felt that desperate right now, Doctor. Kate Sullivan led the team that studied Velthera's data, and she was brilliant and ruthless and completely willing to weaponize things that should never be weaponized, because when you're fighting for survival, ethics become suggestions instead of rules. Kate looked at E3 energy manipulation technology and immediately saw how it could be combined with human nuclear physics to create weapons that would make the E3's own arsenal look like children's toys. She looked at Caruth's ability to manipulate probability and reality and saw how it could be integrated with human neural interfaces to create soldiers who could bend the laws of physics. She looked at everything Velthera had given them, and she saw not just weapons, but a way to turn humanity's weaknesses into strengths, because humans couldn't manipulate reality with their minds like dragons could, and they couldn't shape energy with thoughts like the Etheri could, but they were very, very good at building tools that let them do impossible things. Kate called her project the Synthesis Protocol, and when she explained it to Lisa, the captain had to sit down because the implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. The Synthesis Protocol would take volunteers and bond them neurally to quantum cores derived from Caruth's genetic template, which would let them access a fraction of a dragon's reality warping abilities. It would turn ordinary soldiers into living weapons who could fight the Etheri on equal terms. It would also kill them. Kate was honest about that part because the human nervous system wasn't designed to handle the kind of power that dragons wielded naturally, and the neural bonding would burn out a person's brain. Over weeks or months, depending on how much they used their new abilities, every volunteer would be signing their own death warrant. Maya had been the first to volunteer because of course she had, and Lisa had tried to order her to stand down, but Maya had reminded her captain that she'd already died once on Kepler 4 for 2B, and everything since then was borrowed time anyway. So Maya had undergone the procedure and spent 3 days screaming as her nervous system rewired itself to accommodate powers that no human was meant to have. When she woke up, she could see things that shouldn't be visible and feel things that shouldn't exist. And worst of all, she could feel Caruth's consciousness at the edge of her mind, like an ocean that she could drown in if she wasn't careful. Caruth had felt it too, and for the first time in 10,000 years he'd felt. Humanity had always been good at killing, and when Dr. Kate Sullivan opened Velthera's database to the weapons research team, they proved just how good they could be at taking someone else's technology and making it worse in all the best ways. E3 had developed energy, manipulation over thousands of years, and they'd learned to channel power through crystalline matrices that could reshape matter at the atomic level, but they'd done it carefully with safety protocols and ethical guidelines. That prevented accidents. Human scientists looked at those safety protocols and threw them away because safety was a luxury for species that weren't facing extinction gates. Team took E3 energy manipulation and married it to human nuclear physics, and created something that made even Velthora step back in horror, because the E3 had banned this kind of weapon 3,000 years ago. After they'd accidentally destroyed an entire solar system, testing it, the humans called it a hellfire projector, and it could turn matter directly into plasma without the intermediate steps that normal physics required, and the temperatures it generated were hot enough to ignite atmospheres and boil oceans. Velthora had watched them build the first prototype and asked them if they understood what they were creating, and Kate had looked at her with eyes that held no mercy and said, yes, the second breakthrough came from studying Caruth's biology and understanding how dragons had manipulated reality through what ancient humans had called magic, but was actually mathematics, so advanced that it looked like sorcery. Dragons were living quantum computers, and their bodies could calculate probability paths through reality and choose which path to collapse into existence, and that was how they'd flown without wings and breathed fire without fuel and survived for thousands of years. Without aging, Kate's team couldn't replicate dragon biology exactly, but they could create artificial quantum cores using Caruth's genetic material as a template, and those cores could interface with human neural tissue. If you were willing to accept the consequences, the synthesis protocol was born from that research, and Maya Brooks had been the proof of concept that showed it could work even if it killed you slowly. After Maya's successful bonding, 50 more soldiers volunteered within a day, and Lisa Morgan had tried to limit the number because watching her people sign up to die was breaking her heart, but Kate had reminded her that they were already dying, and at least this way they could take the enemy with them. Commander Helen Price had been the second volunteer, and she was older than Maya by 15 years and had fought in the wars against pirates that plagued the outer colonies before first contact. Helen knew what she was signing up for because Kate had been brutally honest about the survival rates, and Helen had signed the forms anyway because she had children on Mars and grandchildren on Europa, and she'd rather burn out than let them grow up as slaves to the Etheri Empire. The procedure had nearly killed her, and when she woke up she could feel reality itself pressing against her consciousness like a living thing that wanted to be shaped and molded. She had raised her hand and created gravity where none should exist and pulled a wrench across the room without touching it, and then she'd vomited for an hour because her brain wasn't meant to process information in 4 dimensions, but she'd gotten better at it, and so had the other volunteers who followed, and within 3 months, humanity had 50 synthesis pilots who called themselves the Burned because they were burning their lives away one quantum calculation at a time. The Burned trained in secret on a moon base that officially didn't exist, and they learned to do things that violated physics as humans understood it. They learned to manipulate light so they could become invisible or blind enemies with focused radiation. They learned to manipulate gravity so they could fly or crush ships with localized singularities. They learned to manipulate probability so they could dodge weapons fire by simply not being in the place where bullets wanted to go on. They learned to manipulate time just enough to see a few seconds into the future, which gave them reflexes that made them seem superhuman. Caruth watched them train and felt something like pride because these fragile mammals were using power that should have taken millennia to master, and they were doing it in months through sheer stubborn determination. Connected his consciousness to the quantum cores in their bodies, which meant he could feel what they felt and see what they saw. And he experienced human combat rage for the first time in his long existence. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely insane because humans didn't fight with calm calculation the way dragons had. They fought with emotion and fury and a desperate need to survive. Maya had become the unofficial leader of the Burned because she'd been first, and because she understood better than anyone what they were sacrificing. She felt Caruth in her mind constantly now, and sometimes she couldn't tell where her consciousness ended and his began, which should have been frightening, but instead felt comforting because at least she wasn't alone in the dark. The Burned pilots knew They were dying, and they could feel their nervous systems degrading. With each use of their powers, but none of them quit, because quitting meant letting the ethery win. Helen Price gathered her squadron in the training room one night and told them that they were going to be remembered as either heroes or monsters, depending on what they did with the power they'd been given. She told them that the ethery had rules about warfare and honor and proper conduct between civilized species. She told them that humanity was going to break every single one of those rules, because the ethery had broken the only rule that mattered when they'd killed 12,000 civilians without warning. The burned had voted unanimously to show no mercy. Velthera heard about that vote and felt something cold settle in her crystalline chest, because she knew what humans were capable of when they decided that mercy was a weakness. Tried to talk to Maya about it, but Maya had just looked at her with eyes that held starlight and quantum mathematics and said that the ethery had started this war by expecting humans to die quietly. Now they were going to learn that humans didn't do anything quietly. The weapons development continued at a pace that terrified everyone involved, because Kate's team was designing systems that had a 50% chance of killing the user, and they were designing them anyway, because 50% was better odds than facing the ethery. With conventional weapons, they created neural inhibitors that could shut down ethery consciousness across entire ships by exploiting weaknesses in crystalline biology that Velthera had reluctantly shared. They created quantum disruptors that could tear holes in space-time and make ships cease to exist without technically destroying them. They created probability bombs that rewrote local reality so that enemy weapons simply failed to fire, or enemy ships failed to maintain cohesion, or enemy pilots forgot how to fly. Every weapon was a violation of the laws of war that the ethery had established over thousands of years, and every weapon was designed to cause maximum damage with minimum warning. Kate had explained to Lisa that they couldn't beat the ethery in a fair fight, so they needed to make sure no fight was fair. Lisa had approved every single weapon system, even though she knew that history would judge them harshly if humanity survived to have a history. The training of the burned reached completion after 4 months, and by then they'd lost 3 pilots to neural overload and 2 more to quantum feedback that had turned their bodies inside out in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Survivors were harder and colder and more dangerous than any human soldiers had ever been, because they could feel reality bending around them, and they knew that they were walking weapons that would burn out and die within a year. Maya gathered them in the hangar bay of the Defiant and gave them a speech that Lisa recorded for posterity, even though she hoped no one would ever need to hear it. Maya told them that they were the best of humanity and the worst of humanity. All at once she told them that they'd volunteered to become monsters so that humanity's children could remain human. She told them that the ethery would remember the burned for thousands of years, and that memory would either save humanity or doom it, depending on what came after the Adwarthan. She'd looked at each of them in turn and said that she was proud to burn alongside them. Helen Price had stood up and added that the ethery had expected silence after the massacre. Instead, they were going to get thunder. The burned had cheered, and their voices had echoed through the hangar, and Lisa had felt tears on her face because she was sending these people to die, and they were grateful for the opportunity. Ekroth watched through Maya's eyes and felt the weight of human determination settle into his ancient conscious trees. He'd seen species rise and fall across eons, and he'd seen countless civilizations choose survival over principles, but he'd never seen a species choose to become the thing they feared most, just to protect their future dragons. Had ruled reality through calm calculation and perfect mathematics, humans were ruling reality through rage and desperation and a refusal to accept that some battles couldn't be. Wonkaruth decided that maybe humanity's way was better. Velthera stood in her quarters and looked at the data she'd compiled on human weapons development and felt guilt crushing her crystalline form. She'd given humanity the knowledge to fight back, but she'd also given them the knowledge to become something terrible. The Ethery Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and in all that time, no species had ever successfully fought back against their military might, because the Ethery were simply too advanced and too powerful and too confident in their superiority. That confidence died at Proxima Station. The station was a staging ground for the next wave of attacks against human space, and it held 300 Ethery warships, along with supply depots and troop barracks and enough firepower to sterilize a dozen worlds' intelligence from Velthora had given humanity the location and defensive layouts and shift schedules and every other detail that turned an impossible target into merely a suicidal. One captain, Lisa Morgan, stood on the bridge of the Defiant and watched her fleet approach the station through quantum stealth fields that shouldn't exist but did, because human engineers had looked at ethery cloaking technology and made it better through sheer desperation. 50 human ships against 300 ethery warships was still impossible odds, but Lisa wasn't planning to fight fair. The Burned launched first and Maya Brooks led the way with Helen Price on her wing and 48 other pilots who were burning there. Lives away one quantum calculation at a time. They dropped stealth the moment they entered weapons range, and the ethery defenders had approximately 3 seconds to realize what was happening before reality itself turned against them. Maya reached out with her mind and felt Caruth's consciousness merge with hers, and together they bent probability in ways that made physics weaponry weapons fired and missed because Maya and her pilot simply weren't in the places where the targeting computers said they should be. Thari shields activated and failed because Helen manipulated the quantum states of their power cores until the shields thought they were already active. When they weren't, Athari ships tried to maneuver and found their engines producing gravity in directions that shouldn't exist because the Burned had rewritten local space-time to make navigation impossible. The human fleet followed behind the Burned, and their weapons were brutal and efficient and completely without mercy. Hellfire projectors turned ethery ships into expanding clouds of plasma that ignited their neighbors in chain reactions that consumed entire formations. Quantum disruptors tore holes in reality that swallowed ships and crew and left nothing behind except confused sensor readings. Neural inhibitors broadcast across all frequencies and E3. Crews felt their consciousness dissolving as their crystalline biology was forced into shutdown states. Battle lasted 14 minutes. When it was over, Proxima Station was gone, and 300 ethery warships were debris, and the few escape pods that launched were tractored aboard human ships. Where the survivors were taken, prisoner Valthara watched the battle from the Defiant and recorded everything because she knew her people needed to see what humanity had become. She recorded Maya floating in space, surrounded by bent light and twisted gravity, while she crushed an E3 cruiser with focused singularity. She recorded Helen leading her squadron through impossible maneuvers that left after images in spacetime. She recorded the moment when the station's main reactor went critical and the Burned pilots simply redirected the explosion back into subspace so it wouldn't damage the human fleet. She recorded all of it and felt horror and guilt and a terrible pride, because these humans had learned from her people and then surpassed them in the only way that mattered in war. Lisa didn't celebrate the victory because celebrations required joy, and all she felt was exhaustion. 14 minutes of combat had cost her 8 ships and 93 crew members, and 3 of the Burned had pushed their powers too far and burned out
all their nervous systems.
In final desperate attacks, Maya had survived, but Lisa could see the strain in her eyes and the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. Helen had survived, but she'd aged 10 years in 14 minutes, and her hair had gone white from the stress of manipulating reality beyond safe limits. The survivors had proven that humanity could fight the ethery on equal terms, but equal terms meant becoming as terrible as the enemy, and Lisa wasn't sure that was a victory worth celebrating. But the war didn't stop. For moral contemplation and intelligence reports showed 6 more ethery staging grounds scattered across their territory. Lisa gave the order to advance. The second battle was at Rigel 7, and it lasted 9 minutes. The third battle was at Tau Ceti, and it lasted 6 minutes. Each battle was faster than the last because the Burned were learning and adapting and becoming more efficient at killing. Each battle also cost more of them because they were burning brighter and faster, and their bodies couldn't sustain the power they were channeling. Maya lost feeling in her left arm after Tau Ceti, and Kate Sullivan told her that the neural pathways were degrading faster than expected. Maya went back into combat anyway, because what else was she going to do? Helen's vision started failing after the 4th battle, and she compensated by seeing through probability matrices instead of light. Gave her headaches that felt like her skull was cracking, but she went back into combat anyway. The Burned were dying by degrees, but they were taking the E3 with them. The fifth battle was different because the E3 had finally adapted to human tactics. Theed studied the recordings from Proxima Station and Rigel 7, and they developed countermeasures. Against the Burns reality warping, Theed created quantum anchors that stabilized local space-time and prevented probability manipulation. Thiad created neural shielding that protected their crews from inhibitor. Broadcast even created weapons designed specifically to target the quantum core in the burned pilots. The battle at Deneb Station should have been humanity's first major defeat instead. It became their most brutal victory because the E3 had forgotten one important thing about humans, which was that they didn't fight fair even when the rules were in their favor. When the quantum anchors activated and locked down reality, Maya had looked at Helen and grinned and said, "Time to do this the old way." The old way meant using conventional weapons and tactics and raw violence. The old way meant ramming damaged ships into enemy formations. The old way meant boarding actions where human marines fought E3 warriors in hand-to-hand combat inside breached holes. The old way meant accepting casualties that would make any sane commander retreat. Lisa watched her people fight like demons and felt something break inside her because she'd turned them into turned ordinary humans into weapons, and now they couldn't stop being weapons. Even when the quantum powers failed them, the battle at Deneb lasted 43 minutes and cost humanity 18 ships and 400 lives. But the station fell, and the E3 lost their forward command center, and their confidence began to crack. News of human victories spread through the Empire, and for the first time in 3,000 years, the E3 High Council convened an emergency session, expected humans to surrender after Kepler 442. Instead, humanity had turned the Massacre into motivation and built weapons that rivaled E3 technology. They'd expected humans to fight with honor and restraint like civilized species. Instead, humanity fought with rage and cunning and a complete disregard for the rules of warfare. They'd expected humans to be weak. Instead, they'd found a species that got stronger the more you hurt them. The High Council debated for 3 days about how to respond. Some wanted to escalate and commit the full might of the Empire to crush humanity before they became an existential threat. Others wanted to negotiate because they could see where this was heading. The E3 had numbers and technology, but humans had desperation, and that was more dangerous than any weapon. While the council debated, Lisa pushed her fleet deeper into E3's space. She had 32 ships left and 200 burned pilots who were all dying slowly. She went weapons that violated every law of civilized warfare. She had intelligence from Velthora about the location of the Etheri homeworld, and she had orders from Earth to end this war one way or another. Maya came to Lisa's quarters one night and told her captain that the burned had maybe 2 months left before their neural systems failed completely. She told Lisa that they wanted to use those 2 months to hit the Etheri where it would hurt most. She told Lisa that they wanted to attack crystallized. Lisa had looked at Maya and seen not a soldier, but a young woman who should have had decades of life ahead of her, but instead had weak shed, wanted to say noshed, wanted to order the fleet to return to human space and let diplomats handle the rest. But Maya had smiled and said that diplomacy only worked when both sides were afraid. Right now only the E3 were afraid, and humanity needed to keep them that way, so Lisa had given the order, and the fleet had turned toward Crystallis. Of Elthar heard about the plan and went to Maya's quarters to try to talk her out of it. Crystallis wasn't just a planet, it was the heart of Etheri civilization, and attacking it would make humanity monsters in the eyes of every species in the S. Maya had listened and then asked Velthira what the Etheria had expected when they killed 12,000 civilians. Veltha had no answer. To thought Caruth felt the approach to Crystallis through his connection to the burned, and he remembered his own people's final days when they'd realized they were dying as a species. The dragons had gone quietly into extinction because they'd lost the will to fight for survival. Humanity was doing the opposite, and Caruth wasn't sure if that was noble or terrifying. Crystallis hung in space like a jewel carved from frozen starlight, and it was beautiful in the way that things built over thousands of years by an advanced civilization could be beautiful. But Maya Brooks looked at it and saw only the place where Decisions had been made to destroy her home. The planet wasn't entirely physical because the Aethery had learned to anchor parts of their world in quantum dimensions, which made it nearly impossible to attack with conventional weapons and completely impossible to destroy without tearing a hole in reality that would consume everything within a dozen light years. Captain Lisa Morgan had known this when she gave the order to attack, and she'd accepted that her fleet would die here. What she hadn't expected was for Velthera to ask for access to the communication arrays. The Aethery scientist stood on the bridge of the Defiant and looked at Lisa with crystalline eyes that held determination and fear in equal measure. Of Velthera told Lisa that weapons wouldn't win this war because even if humanity destroyed Crystallis, the Empire would simply retaliate by burning every human world to ash. But words might win because the Aethery High Council was already divided and afraid and uncertain about how to handle a species that refused to follow the rules. Lisa had hesitated because giving Velthera access to broadcast communications meant trusting that she wouldn't betray humanity at the last moment. But then she'd looked at Maya and seen the way the young lieutenant's body was failing after months of channeling power that no human was meant to hold. Shed looked at Helen Price, whose hair had gone white and whose hands shook even when she was resting. She looked at all the burned pilots who'd volunteered to die so that humanity could survive. And she'd decided that maybe words were worth trying before everyone died, so she'd given Velthora access to the arrays and told her to make it. Count Velthora had composed her message carefully because she knew she'd only get one chance. She didn't address the High Council or the military commanders or the fleet marshal. Instead, she broadcast on open frequencies so that every Aethery in the system could hear. She told them about finding the ruins of Kepler 44b and meeting Maya Brooks, who should have killed her but chose mercy instead. Told them about watching humanity turn grief into weapons and desperation into strength. She told them about the burned pilots who were dying slowly because they'd volunteered to become monsters so their children wouldn't have to. She told them that the Aethery had attacked Kepler 442b because they were afraid of competition, but fear wasn't a good reason to commit genocide. And she told them that humanity wasn't asking for surrender or even peace. They were just asking to be left alone to build their lives among the stars. If the Aethery couldn't grant that simple request, then humanity would burn the galaxy down before they let themselves be erased. Velthera's broadcast lasted 7 minutes, and when it ended, there was silence across every Aethery frequency. Then, Caruth did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He reached out through the quantum connections. He shared with the burned pilots and amplified Velthera's message across dimensions that normal communication couldn't reach. His voice echoed through probability matrices and quantum foam and the spaces between spaces where reality was thin. He told the Aethery that he'd watched humanity grow from primitive apes into a species that could split atoms and travel to other worlds. He told them that dragons had been gods once, and they'd chosen to sleep rather than watch humanity destroy itself. But humanity hadn't destroyed itself. They'd survived and grown and become stubborn and angry and very, very hard to kill. Told the Aethery that his kind had ruled reality through power and wisdom, but humanity ruled reality through spite and determination. Spite was a much more reliable motivation than wisdom. The dragon's laughter rolled across the quantum dimensions, and every Aethery in the system felt it in their crystalline bones. High Council received Velthera's broadcast in Caruth's amplification, and for the first time in 3,000 years they felt something they'd almost forgotten. Fear of humanity's weapons, though. Those were terrifying enough. Fear of what humanity represented. Every species the Aethery had encountered had either submitted peacefully or fought briefly before accepting defeat. Humanity had done Nithithid, turned massacre into motivation and impossible odds into challenges, and they'd built weapons that shouldn't exist through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that some things couldn't be done. If the Aethery destroyed humanity, then they'd prove that humans were right to fight. But if they negotiated, then they'd admit weakness. The Emperor of the Aethery had ruled for 600 years, and he'd never faced a decision this difficult. He could order the fleet to destroy the human ships and then move on to burn every human world, but intelligence reports showed that humans were spread across a dozen star systems now, and eliminating them would require committing resources that the Empire needed elsewhere. He could try something that no HFY Emperor had done in recorded history. He could admit that the Empire had made a mistake. The Emperor opened a communication channel to the defiant, and Lisa Morgan found herself face to face with a being that had ruled civilizations longer than humanity had existed. Emperor told her that the attack on Kepler-4 had been unauthorized, and excessive it was a lie, and everyone knew it was a lie. But it gave both sides a way to save face. He told her that the E3 Empire was willing to recognize human sovereignty over their claimed territories. In exchange, humanity would cease hostilities and return to their space. Lisa had looked at Maya, who was barely able to stand anymore because her nervous system was shutting down. Looked at her tactical display showing 32 damaged ships against the defensive grid that could vaporize them in seconds. Shed looked at Velthor Hood, betrayed her entire species to help humanity survive, and she'd told the Emperor that humanity would accept his terms on one condition. HFY would help humanity save the burned pilots. The Emperor had been confused because his intelligence reports had told him the pilots were dying, and nothing could stop that. Lisa had explained that HFY medical technology was thousands of years more advanced than human medicine. The Empire wanted peace, then saving the pilots who'd fought for humanity's survival was the price the Emperor had agreed, because it was a small price to pay for ending a war that was making the Empire look weak. The Treaty of Ash and Crystal was signed aboard the Defiant 3 days later. Lisa Morgan represented humanity. Even though she had no authority to negotiate treaties, the HFY Emperor attended personally because this was too important to delegate to Veltha. And Caruth stood as witnesses to the agreement. The treaty established boundaries and protocols and all the usual diplomatic language that treaties required, but the real treaty was simpler. The E3 would leave humanity alone. Humanity stay in their own space. Both sides would pretend that the war had been a misunderstanding rather than attempted genocide. Maya Brooks lived long enough to see the treaty signed, and then her body finally gave out. Kate Sullivan and a team of HFY physicians worked for 18 hours to save her. They'd used technology that was normally reserved for High Council members and techniques that had been perfected over millennia. Maya survived, but she'd never be the same. The neural pathways that had let her channel quantum power were burned out beyond repair. Couldn't manipulate reality anymore. She was just human again. Helen Price and the other surviving burned pilots received the same treatment. Some of them survived and some didn't, because even theory medicine had limits, but more survived than would have if humanity had been alone. The war ended not with celebration, but with exhaustion. Humanity it's proven they could fight, but they'd also learned the cost of fighting. 50 years later, children played in the rebuilt colony on Kepler-4 to be human. Children and E3 younglings learned together, because the treaty had eventually led to cultural exchanges and trade agreements, and all the things that happened when species decided cooperation was better than extinction. Velthor tended a memorial garden where 12,000 names were carved in crystal and stone. She was old now, even by HFY standards, but she still came to the garden every day. Mia visited sometimes when her health allowed. They'd sit together in silence and remember the war neither of them wanted, but both of them. Caruth had returned to sleep after the treaty was signed because he'd seen enough war to last another 10,000 years. But before he slept, he told Maya that he was proud of humanity, not because they'd won, but because they'd chosen to stop fighting when they could have kept going. That was wisdom, and maybe humanity was growing up after all. The memorial garden had statues at its center. One showed Velthara, in the moment she'd chosen to defect. One showed Caruth with his wings spread wide. One showed Maya holding a rifle in one hand and extending the other in mercy. The inscription below read simple words that summarized everything. They expected silence, we gave them thunder. They expected submission, we gave them fire. They expected nothing, we gave them everything. This is humanity's true strength, not that we cannot break, but that we refuse to stay broken. Lisa Morgan retired from military service and spent her remaining years writing about the war. Her memoirs were required reading in both human and E3 military academies, not as a guide to tactics, but as a warning about the cost of underestimating desperate species. Burned, who survived the war, became legends.